not those kinds of levels. We are talking in the US context about possibly having inflation as high as it was during Ronald Reagan's second term, not a hyperinflation scenario.
But we're talking about a time, first of all, the concern as to whether you can keep it to that. And that is their concern about runaway inflation, one of their concerns, not least. I mean, Angela Merkel says, we're not saying that saving solves all problems, but you can't spend more than you take in. You can't live your whole life this way. Everybody knows that.
The trouble is you also cannot collectively spend less than you earn. What's happening right now is everyone is trying to run a financial surplus. Everyone is trying to slash spending while continuing to earn as much as before so that they can run a surplus. And the trouble is, again, my spending is your income, your spending is my income. If
so
we all
she's
do
wrong.
This the same, she is wrong.
The Bundesbank president is wrong.
Oh yes, he's definitely wrong.
And but the former chief economist of Deutsche Bank, who says, I can't stand this rubbish anymore about the arguments the arguments that you're putting forward, well, he's wrong too.
You know, yes, they actually are wrong. I mean, we've had, what can we say? One of the points, I do have a book in which I try to actually advance a fair bit of evidence here, and one of the points is that people who look at the situation my way have been much more right these past 3 years about what was going to happen to interest rates, about what was going to happen to inflation, about what the effects of austerity policies were going to be than the people who've taken the other view. A lot of the people who are now telling you we must do this were also the ones who are predicting, as I say, that the confidence fairy was going to come to the rescue, that you would slash spending and your economy would boom because people were so confident about the future. That has not panned out. Keynesian stories about how slashing spending in a depression hurts the economy have panned out.
And yet this idea of a confidence fairy, there will be people who say that what you're talking about, it's a sort of fairy tale story.
But it's not. It is the experience of history. It is, the fact of the matter is, how did we end the Great Depression? And we actually did spend our way out of the Great Depression.
But look at what you're talking about, because there will be those who say, look, you're right. But then you go through your book where you set out this sort of really damning picture, and then you come to the conclusion of what you're actually proposing. And what you're proposing is what? For when we look at from the United States, that you have a stimulus of $300 billion a year, which is actually what you were proposing a couple of years ago, that you change the inflation target to 4% from 2%, and you basically allow households who are struggling with the high interest that they're paying on their mortgages to remortgage at lower rates.
Yes, it's a surprisingly modest solution. I mean, I guess I'm not quite sure how you're hearing it, but I think of those as being relatively modest things to do. And yet, the part of the point is that we actually have had some gradual repair work in the United States. Household balance sheets are better than they were a few years ago. We've built almost no houses for about 5 years now. So we are actually in a position where recovery is not as difficult a proposition as it was 3 years ago.
Exactly, and growth, there is growth. It's, in fact, apart from Canada, America is doing better than any other G8 countries. Unemployment is still high, but it's heading in the right direction. And they haven't followed your medicine thus far.
No, but think about how long it's going on now. And part of the... Although we have some, this is what, by the way, the reason I use depression rather than recession. A recession is when things are heading down. A depression is when things are down. And although, yes, you know, unemployment has been dropping, but largely because people have been dropping out of the labor force. Employment has been growing, but only barely faster than population. Do we want to sit through 5, 10 years of this? Do we want to suffer a lost decade, especially given the enormous cumulative damage this does to people's lives and even to the economy's potential? So that's why it's end this depression now with an exclamation point, rather than wait for 5, 10 years of healing to slowly bring us back to an acceptable economic position. Why not cut through that with a fairly modest but forceful program of recovery?
How angry are you about this? Because your language is very strident. I mean, you've been talking about people being wrong. I mean, let's take a look at what you said about Ben Bernanke, the Federal Reserve Chairman. You said he's been like, it's like he's been assimilated by the Borg, who are the Star Trek villain. Yes. But he's reckless.
Yes, well, and you should be angry. I mean, so the American context is the one I know best, but the amount of human damage that's being done by this is enormous. We've got 4 million people in the U.S. who've been out of work for more than a year. There hasn't been anything like that since the 1930s. That's an incredible hardship. That's destroying people's lives. We have a whole cohort of college graduates who are graduating into a job market that has no use for them, and who are graduating from college with large debts and very likely never going to have the kind of career that would allow them to pay those debts. Allowing this to persist is an incredibly cruel thing among everything else.
Allowing it to persist. But, you know, Ben Bernanke says of these comments that, that it doesn't make sense to actively seek a high inflation rate in order to achieve a slightly faster reduction in the unemployment rate. The view of the Federal Open Market Committee is that it would be very reckless, because the argument is that they're doubtful gains. If you could guarantee it, sure, but it's doubtful.
People have the wrong notion of what is reckless and what the risks are. So it's considered reckless to take any action to try and bring down this incredibly high unemployment, especially long-term unemployment, when in fact that long-term unemployment is inflicting vast damage as we speak, but it's considered responsible to let it persist, to not try something different. So I liked a fellow who wrote back in 2000 that we should have, in this kind of situation, we should have Rooseveltian resolve. We should be willing to do whatever it takes. And if one thing doesn't work,
it's just an
try something
experiment.
else.
Yours is an experiment as much as theirs is an experiment.
Except that we have some indication from history. And of course, the person who called for that Rooseveltian resolve called for doing whatever it takes and trying things, not letting this slide, was a fellow by the name of Ben Bernanke, writing highly critically of the Bank of Japan back in the year 2000. The idea that we have acclimated ourselves to this horrible situation, that we've accepted all of this essentially gratuitous pain for families, for workers, as being part of the responsible thing is to sit there and accept it. That is something that should make you angry.
But no, but this is the argument. I'm sure people watching would be angry with you for suggesting that they are accepting it. And Professor Anthony Karidakis of New York University says of you that your views are not closely related to the reality in which Bernanke is forced to operate, and this may explain why his views have changed. One of them has the responsibility of steering the economy through treacherous waters. The other has the luxury of sitting in his office and sending articles to the New York Times. Oh. Maybe you'd change your mind if you were sitting in the Federal Reserve.
I can well understand that. I'd love to know what Ben Bernanke's private thoughts are. Right? I suspect that he is actually not as orthodox as he sounds in public, but I don't know that. But the point, of course, is that he faces political constraints. It's not supposed to, but he does face political constraints. He faces a board, and I can well understand that he is not able to just go ahead and be as aggressive as I like. But I think I'm doing him a favor, because he's getting all of this attack from the right, saying do less, and I'm saying, you should be doing more. Your own writings say you should be doing more.
Well, perhaps that might be one of the aims of your book. But one of the other aims that you say of your book is that to bring pressure by means of an informed public.
Exactly.
And I wonder what you want the public. You want them to get angry? Do you want them to take to the streets?
I think a little bit, yes. I mean, and the fact of the matter is, so we had the Occupy movement in the United States, and it was a little inchoate and a little bit scrappy. But it actually changed the conversation in a very positive direction. Before the Occupy protests began, it was all deficit hawkery, and the issue of unemployment and the issue of inequality had completely disappeared from our political discourse. And then suddenly real people out there, not part of our political establishment, said, hey, there's real suffering out here, and you are not dealing with it. And the political establishment, at least to some extent, took notice. So no, by all means.
But to what extent, though? Because you've already been very rude about the Republicans. It's an election year. What actually is going to change? You're calling for people on the streets, and one wonders what effect that would have.
Well, for one thing, we are having an election, and I think it's important for people to understand what's at stake. Certainly the tone of the Obama administration has changed. They have become more activist in their rhetoric, not yet in their policies, because at the moment they can't actually do very much. But that's the kind of change we're hoping for. It's very important not to just accept that this is the new normal, that this depression is the way it's going to be, and nothing can be done except wait for the market to heal itself, that in the long run it'll all work out, which it may or may not be true, but as Keynes said, in the long run we're all dead. And meanwhile, let's solve this problem now.
Paul Krugman, thank you for coming on
Thank
Hardtalk.
you.